Get out, bitch. The sound of the slap echoed through the sterile emergency room, freezing every doctor and patient in their tracks. CEO Richard Kessler had just struck a nurse in front of the entire hospital staff at St. Gabriel. The reason was simple. She had saved a bleeding man before he could even start his intake paperwork. She didn't fight back. She simply unclipped her badge, placed it on the desk, and whispered, "Your stitches should hold." Then she walked into the rain. Behind her, the man she saved dialed a number. They fired the medic. 10 minutes later, a Navy helicopter landed. St. Gabriel Medical Center in Boston was not just a hospital. It was a cathedral of glass, steel, and high-end commerce. It was famous across the East Coast for its cutting-edge technology and its world-class surgeons. However, it was equally famous for its astronomical treatment costs and its rigid, almost suffocating management system. The hospital operated like a high-speed engine, but it was an engine that only ran on the fuel of paperwork and insurance. Every single patient, regardless of the severity of their trauma, was required to complete a mountain of forms before a medical professional was even allowed to lay a finger on them. At St. Gabriel, efficiency was not measured in lives saved. Instead, success was measured in billing cycles completed, liability waivers signed, and the profit margins of the quarterly report. It was a place where the human soul was often traded for a corporate signature. In the middle of this cold corporate machine worked Emma Carter. At 26 years old, Emma was a rookie nurse who had been on the job for exactly 3 months. She was a woman of very few words. Her blonde hair was always kept in a tight, practical bun, and her blue eyes remained calm, unnervingly calm, even when the ER was screaming with the chaos of a Friday night rush. She carried herself with a disciplined posture, a silent remnant of a life she didn't talk about. Emma was the one who usually took the late-night shifts that no one else wanted to work. She was the one who handled the difficult, messy cases that the veteran nurses tried to avoid. She walked the halls like a shadow, unnoticed by the powerful people who ran the institution. Her colleagues were often dismissive of her. Because she was quiet and kept to herself, many assumed she was inexperienced or simply lacked the fire needed for the intensity of the ER. Some of the older nurses even thought Emma was too naive for the job because she consistently prioritized the patient's immediate comfort over the hospital's bureaucratic procedures. They whispered in the break room that she was a bleeding heart who didn't understand how the real world of medical business worked. They saw her as a temporary hire, someone who wouldn't last. They predicted she would quit within a year. They thought the high-pressure environment of a private hospital would eventually break her spirit. They couldn't have been more wrong. However, the senior doctors began to notice something different about Emma Carter. In emergency situations, she reacted faster than anyone else in the room. While other staff members were waiting for instructions or checking the computer for insurance codes, Emma was already preparing the intubation kit or the trauma tray. When she handled a wound, her hands were impossibly steady. In fact, she could stitch a complex laceration much faster and more precisely than many nurses who had been there for 20 years. There was a rhythmic, almost mechanical grace to her movements. It suggested she had practiced these skills in a place far more dangerous than a clean, quiet hospital in Boston. Despite her obvious skill, Emma rarely spoke about her past. No one knew where she had lived or where she had received her training before arriving at St. Gabriel. She never shared stories of her past patients or her life before the city. To the staff, she was just an anonymous young woman trying to find her place in the medical world. And it was exactly this perception of her as a nobody that led people to underestimate her so drastically. They saw a rookie, but they were looking at a master of her craft. In reality, veteran emergency responders know that the golden hour is often a lie. Sometimes you don't have an hour. Sometimes you only have a golden minute. Those who have been forged in high-pressure environments which develop a combat reflex. It is a deep-seated instinct to stop the bleeding first and ask questions never. Emma had that reflex. She was a professional who knew that in the world of life and death, rules are secondary to the pulse under your hand. She understood that a system designed to protect profits could never truly protect people. She knew that the bureaucracy was a barrier between the healer and the hurting. Emma continued to work in the shadows of the hospital, quietly saving lives while being ignored by the administration. She didn't seek praise, and she didn't care for the hospital politics. But this clash between her human touch and the hospital's cold rules was about to reach a violent breaking point. The rookie was about to become the center of a storm. It was a storm that would shake St. Gabriel to its very foundations and expose the rot at the heart of the institution. Emma Carter was ready, even if the hospital wasn't. If you've ever seen a good person being looked down upon just because they were doing the right thing, type unjust. The sky over Boston had turned a bruised shade of purple as a heavy, freezing rainstorm began to lash the city. It was the kind of rain that soaked through everything in seconds. Inside St. Gabriel, the emergency department was descending into a state of managed panic. The storm had caused several multi-car accidents on the highway, sending a flood of patients to the doors. The waiting room was overflowing with people. Some were angry, some were crying, and all were waiting for the bureaucracy to clear them for treatment so they could finally see a doctor. The administrative pressure to follow protocol was at an all-time high because CEO Richard Kessler was on site for a surprise inspection. Every staff member was walking on eggshells. Through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby, an old man could be seen struggling against the wind. He was wearing an old, worn trench coat that had seen better days. As he reached for the heavy brass handle, his foot hit a patch of slick, wet marble. He went down with a sickening thud. The sound was dull and heavy, echoing in the quiet lobby. His head struck the sharp, decorative edge of a granite planter. Immediately, a pool of dark, arterial blood began to spread across the white stone, mixing with the freezing rainwater. The man groaned, his hand reaching for the wound, but he was losing consciousness fast. He lay there on the cold ground, ignored by the world passing by behind the glass. The security guard inside the lobby watched the accident through the glass. He reached for his radio, his voice flat and devoid of any real concern or urgency. "We have a slip and fall in the entryway. Notify janitorial for a cleanup. Advise the subject to move to the intake queue." The guard didn't move an inch from his post. According to the hospital handbook, he wasn't allowed to leave his station to assist a non-admitted person unless a medical team was already present. The rules were clear. No paperwork meant no entry. No entry meant no medical assistance. It was a cold, circular logic that left the man bleeding out just a few feet away from help. Emma Carter saw the fall from across the triage desk. She didn't look at the security guard. She didn't check the clock or look for a supervisor to ask for permission. While the other nurses were busy arguing over insurance codes and bed assignments, she grabbed a trauma kit and a roll of sterile gauze. She moved with a purpose that silenced the room. She burst through the sliding doors and into the freezing rain. She knelt in the bloody puddle next to the man, her scrubs immediately soaking up the cold, dirty water. She checked his pulse. It was thready and weak, and examined the wound. It was a deep, jagged laceration that had nicked the temporal artery. Blood was pulsing out with every heartbeat. "I've got you, sir. Stay with me. Keep your eyes on me," Emma said. Her voice wasn't the soft, quiet voice she used in the break room. It was sharp, loud, and full of command. She hauled the man up using a specific physical technique that allowed her to carry someone twice her weight with ease. She dragged him toward the warmth of the lobby. As she pushed back into the building, a head administrator intercepted her. "Nurse Carter, what are you doing? This man hasn't been processed yet. You can't just bring him in." "You know the rules about using trauma bays for walk-ins during an inspection," the administrator shouted, her face pale with worry about what the CEO would think. Emma didn't even look at her. She kept moving toward Trauma Bay 4, her boots squeaking loudly on the marble. "Call intake while I stop the bleeding," she snapped over her shoulder. "If his heart stops in this lobby because you were worried about a form, it's on your head. Move." Emma's intensity was terrifying, and the administrator finally stood up at the side. Inside the trauma bay, Emma worked with a ferocity that stunned the nearby staff. She didn't use the standard hospital cleaning kit. She reached for her own specialized tools. She cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, her movements calculated and incredibly fast. Then she began to stitch. The way she handled the needle was almost hypnotic. She wasn't just sewing skin, She was closing a wound with a rhythm that suggested she had done this thousands of times in the dark, perhaps under much worse conditions. The man, who introduced himself as Walter Davis, was watching her very closely. He was a man of about 65, with a face like a roadmap of lived experience and hardship. He didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. Instead, he studied the way Emma tied her knots, a very specific, high-tension combat suture used by elite military medics. "Where did you learn to stitch like that, girl?" Walter asked, his voice steady despite the blood loss and the shock. He looked her directly in the eye, searching for an answer. "Nursing school, sir," Emma answered shortly, her eyes never leaving the wound. She worked with a focus that didn't allow for idle conversation or distractions. Walter Davis let out a small, dry laugh. "I've been stitched up by the best in the world. You didn't learn that in a nursing school in Boston." "I know those knots. Those are field expedient sutures. That's the Kunar knot. I haven't seen that since I was in the mountains of Afghanistan," Walter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Emma paused for a fraction of a second. Her needle hovered in the air. Her blue eyes met his, and for a moment a silent recognition passed between them. It was a shared secret born of fire, dust, and survival. It was the bond of the battlefield. Then she went back to work. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Davis." "I'm just a rookie," she added, but the conviction in her voice was gone. Walter knew better. He knew exactly what kind of woman was standing in front of him. By now, a crowd of nurses and administrators had gathered at the entrance of the bay. They were terrified. They knew that Richard Kessler was just down the hall. They knew that Emma was committing career suicide by breaking the hospital's most sacred rule. The paperwork must always come before the patient's pulse. They watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the rookie nurse finished the final stitch, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of the end for the old regime. If you've ever completely misjudged a good person just because they were humble and quiet, type, I was wrong. The atmosphere in the emergency department turned from tense to icy the moment CEO Richard Kessler stepped into the hallway. He was a man who exuded cold corporate power. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's annual rent. He lived by a simple philosophy: a hospital is a business, and a business must have perfect order. When he saw the trail of bloody water leading into Trauma Bay 4, his eyes narrowed with a dangerous intensity. He felt the disruption of his perfect system like a physical wound. Kessler walked into the bay and looked at the old man lying on the bed. He then looked at the empty intake chart hanging on the wall. The lack of data made him feel livid. "Explain this immediately," Kessler said. His voice was calm, which everyone in the hospital knew was the precursor to a violent, professional explosion. "The patient suffered a severe arterial laceration in the entryway," Emma said, her hand still moving with the needle. "He was losing blood rapidly. I brought him here. I had to stabilize him before he went into full cardiac arrest," she continued, her voice showing no fear. She was focused on the patient, not the man in the expensive suit. Kessler stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. "And where is his insurance verification? Where is his identification? Where is the file?" "There isn't even a social security number on this file," he hissed. "You are using our most expensive trauma equipment on a man who hasn't even been admitted to the system." "He was unconscious when I found him, sir," Emma said, finally finishing the last stitch and setting her tools down. Saving his life was the only priority at the time. "The paperwork can be done now that he's stable and breathing," she added. It seemed like a logical answer to her, but to Kessler it was an act of open rebellion. "That's not how we work at St. Gabriel," Kessler hissed. He turned to the head administrator who was shaking in her shoes. "Is this how you've been training the staff? Do we just treat this place like a free clinic now? To ignore the very protocols that keep this institution alive and profitable?" Kessler's voice was rising in pitch and anger. Emma stood up and faced him. She was much smaller than Kessler, but she didn't look intimidated. She had stood her ground against much scarier men than him in her life. "The protocols were designed for business, Mr. Kessler, but medicine is about people. If I had waited for your intake process, this man would have bled out on your porch. He would be a corpse right now while you were worrying about his insurance provider, she said, her voice echoing in the silent bay. The staff held their collective breath. The room went deathly silent. No one ever talked back to Richard Kessler. He felt his authority being challenged in front of his entire staff, and his temper finally snapped. In a moment of pure, unchecked rage, Kessler swung his hand. Crack! The sound of the slap was so loud it seemed to echo through the entire hospital. Emma's head snapped to the side, and she stumbled back against a tray of surgical instruments. The metal trays clattered to the floor, adding to the shock of the moment. A collective gasp of horror went through the room. A young nurse in the back started to cry into her mask. "You are fired," Kessler whispered, his face trembling with an ugly anger. "Get out of my hospital right now. You are a low-level rookie who thinks she's a hero." "You are nothing," he continued. "I will make sure you never hold a medical license in this state again. I will crush your career before it even begins. Get out." Emma didn't cry. She didn't even rub her cheek, which was already starting to swell and turn a deep, angry red. She looked at Kessler with a terrifying level of emptiness. It was the look of someone who had seen real monsters and wasn't afraid of a man in a suit. It was a look that should have made Kessler run for cover, but he was too arrogant to see it. Slowly, Emma reached up and unclipped her ID badge. She placed it on the metal tray, right next to the suture kit she had just used to save a life. It was a final, silent gesture. She turned to Walter Davis, ignoring the CEO entirely. "Your stitches should hold, Mr. Davis. Please make sure to follow up with a real doctor in a week. Don't let it get wet." "I'm sorry, girl," Walter said, his voice full of a cold, simmering fury. He looked at Kessler like he was looking at a piece of trash that needed to be thrown away. "Don't be," Emma said. She turned and walked out of the hospital, her head held high, disappearing into the pouring rain without looking back at the life she was leaving behind. Kessler adjusted his tie and looked at his staff. "Back to work, all of you, and get this man out of here. Transfer him to the city hospital immediately. He's not our problem." But Walter Davis wasn't leaving. He reached into his wet coat and pulled out a rugged, military-grade satellite phone. He pressed a single speed dial button with a bloody thumb. "It's Davis," he said into the phone. "The hospital is St. Gabriel's. A civilian CEO just assaulted the medic. My medic. The one who saved the unit in the valley. The one who took a bullet to pull me out of the fire," Walter added. There was a pause. 10 minutes? Good. I'll be waiting on the roof. Make sure you bring everyone." 10 minutes passed in a blur of nervous energy. The staff tried to work, but they kept looking at the ceiling. Then the windows of the hospital began to rattle violently. A low-frequency thumping sound began to build, shaking the floor and rattling the medicine cabinets. A massive United States Navy SH-60 Seahawk helicopter dropped out of the sky. It landed directly on the hospital's manicured front lawn, its searchlights blinding the security guards. The rotors kicked up a storm of grass and rainwater against the windows. The doors of the hospital burst open as a squad of Navy Shore Patrol, led by a high-ranking officer in full-dress whites, marched into the lobby. They didn't look happy. The officer was Commander Ryan Cole. He didn't stop at the reception desk. He walked straight into the ER, his boots thundering on the floor. He looked like a storm incarnate. "Where is Chief Petty Officer Emma Carter?" Cole demanded, his voice booming and echoing through the trauma bays. He looked at every face until he found Kessler. Kessler, now looking pale and confused, stepped forward. I don't know who that is. We had a nurse named Carter, but she was fired for gross misconduct." Commander Cole stepped into Kessler's personal space, his eyes like daggers. "You didn't fire a nurse, you idiot. You fired a Navy hero. You fired a legend." Chief Carter was the lead combat medic for the SEAL teams. 3 years ago, my unit was ambushed in a valley. We were pinned down for 12 hours in the dirt. Emma Carter was the only person who kept 20 men alive while taking fire from 3 sides. She has a Bronze Star with valor. She is more important than this whole building. He looked at Walter Davis. "And the man you just tried to throw out? That's Master Chief Walter Davis. He's a Medal of Honor recipient and a personal friend of the Secretary." Kessler's knees buckled. He looked at the Navy soldiers, then at the Master Chief. He realized he hadn't just fired a rookie, he had declared war on the United States Navy. If you have ever owed a debt of gratitude to someone who stood by you in your darkest hour, type, I am indebted. The atmosphere in St. Gabriel's changed in an instant. The power that Richard Kessler had used to bully his staff for years simply evaporated under the cold, hard gaze of the Navy. The doctors and nurses, who had lived in fear of losing their jobs and their reputations, finally found their voices. The silence that had protected Kessler was finally broken. One senior surgeon stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. She was right, Commander. She was the only one with the courage to do her job. We all stood by and watched the clock while a man was dying, he continued. Kessler slapped her because she prioritized a human life over a profit margin. We all saw it. Kessler tried to speak, but no words came out. He was a man who had built his life on rules, and he was realizing that the rules of honor were far more powerful than his own. Commander Cole didn't waste any more time on Kessler. He and Walter Davis walked out of the hospital and into the rain. They didn't have to look very far to find her. They found Emma Carter sitting on a wooden bench at a bus stop a block away. She was shivering in her wet scrubs, her face bruised and swollen from the slap she had received. But she was still calm. She looked up as the black military SUVs pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing in the dark. She stood up as Commander Cole approached her. Chief Carter, Commander Cole said, standing in the rain and offering a crisp, respectful salute. It was a salute reserved for heroes, and he meant every bit of it. Emma stood up, her muscle memory taking over. She returned the salute, her hand perfectly steady despite the cold and the pain. Commander, you're a long way from the base. Master Chief Davis called in a favor, Cole said, nodding toward Walter. And the Navy doesn't forget its own, especially not the medic who saved the most decorated unit in the fleet. Walter Davis stepped out of the car and took Emma's hands. I recognized the handiwork, Emma. I knew it was you the moment you touched that wound with those steady hands. I told you 3 years ago that if you ever needed anything, you just had to call, Walter said. You didn't call. You just tried to disappear into this quiet life. I just wanted to be a regular nurse, Walter, Emma whispered. I wanted a life where people weren't shooting at me. I wanted to help people without the weight of the war. A quiet life doesn't mean you let a man like Kessler walk all over you, son, Walter said. The Navy wants you back, Emma. But more than that, the world needs to know the truth. They need to know what happened in that building tonight, he added. They need to know that there are still people who choose life over money every single time. As they spoke, a group of nurses and doctors from St. Gabriel ran out into the rain. They didn't care about their coats or their hair. They surrounded Emma in a circle of support. They apologized to her for their silence. They told her they were sorry for not standing up for her when it mattered most. They told her that her courage had changed them. They told her that because of her, the hospital board was meeting right now to remove Kessler from his position forever. They said she had saved the soul of the hospital. Emma looked at her former co-workers and smiled for the first time. I don't need an apology, she said. I just need to know that you'll do the right thing next time. I need to know that the next time someone falls in that lobby, you won't wait for the paperwork. You'll just save them, she added. The nurses nodded, their eyes full of tears. The rookie nurse was gone, replaced by the hero they had always known she was. Emma didn't just save Walter Davis that night. She saved the conscience of an entire institution. She showed them that one person standing firm in their values can bring down a mountain of corporate greed. She was a medic, and her work was finally done at St. Gabriel. If this story makes you want to live a life of kindness and courage, no matter the cost, type, I will be kind. The events at St. Gabriel Medical Center became a turning point for medical ethics in the city. The story of the slapped medics went viral, reaching millions of people around the world. It touched a nerve with people who were tired of being treated like numbers in a heartless system. It reminded everyone that at the core of medicine is a spirit of service. Richard Kessler was removed from his position the following morning. The assault charge, combined with the military investigation, ensured that he would never work in healthcare again. His name became a warning to other CEOs who thought they could put profits over people. But the real change wasn't about the CEO's fall, it was about the new culture of the hospital. Walter Davis recovered quickly, his Cunard knot stitches holding perfectly, just as Emma had promised they would. He spent much of his time visiting other veterans after that. He told them about the girl who refused to let the system win. He became a symbol of the bond between those who serve and those who save. He never forgot her face. Commander Ryan Cole often used Emma's story in his training sessions for new Navy medics. He taught them that the technical skills are important, but character is what truly saves. He reminded them that the most powerful tool a medic has is their refusal to give up on a patient, regardless of the rules or the danger. He made sure her legacy lived on. Emma Carter never went back to St. Gabriel. She didn't want the spotlight or the high-paying management positions they offered her to make up for the scandal. Instead, she opened a small community clinic in a neighborhood that the big hospitals had forgotten. She worked for herself, and she worked for the people who had no one else. She remained humble, quiet, and incredibly skilled. She still stitched wounds with that same rhythmic grace. She was still a medic, in the truest sense of the word. The staff at St. Gabriel still talk about her to this day. They call her the ghost medic. They remember the way she stood her ground against a powerful man and won. They remember how she walked into the rain without a word of complaint. Her story reminds them every day that the most important part of medicine is the human touch. In a world that often feels cold and driven by profit, Emma Carter's story is a reminder that heroes are among us. They are often hiding in plain sight, doing the hard work. They are the ones who do the right thing when no one is watching. They are the ones who carry the weight of the world on their shoulders without ever asking for a thank you. Sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one who will save your life. Sometimes, the rookie nurse is actually the greatest warrior in the room. And sometimes, a single slap can start a revolution of kindness. Emma Carter taught the world that honor isn't found in a title, but in the choices we make every single day. If you believe that compassion still exists in this world, comment, respect medics, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel SN Touching Stories to follow more emotional, true, and inspiring stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching, and stay kind.